Thank you for taking the time to do this. It's such an interesting story.
It is. Yeah, yeah, I just don't know that much, but it's a it's a start. I mean,
Wrote that whole paper on it, so which is pretty amazing.
but but yeah, it's I mean, it's unfortunate that it's not better known, because I think it's a really interesting story overall.
Well, this is definitely the first step. And yeah, I mean, I think just the whole group, the fact that there were so many different types of Asian Americans in there, I
Hmm.
wonder if it was, I mean, did you have a sense whether it was unique at its time or was this something that's very much ingrained in like Hawaiian culture?
I think a little of both.
Uh-huh.
I mean, just Hawaii, just because of the demographics, of course.
Right.
Um, and then you had both, national figures who were actively seeking out Asian Americans, and then, people locally as well. So I think that, I think the the theory I had was that, and this, you see this also with a group of swimmers as well in Hawaii, who were Olympic caliber swimmers. But unfortunately, this was during the 40s, so there were no Olympics in 1940 or 1944. So that story sort of gets kind of it doesn't come to its conclusion in a lot of ways, in the same way that it did for the weightlifters. But it was similar, right? Where there was kind of a local figure, a local swimming coach who really sought out these local youth and, you know, had them, train them to become world-class swimmers. And again, it was kind of this multi-ethnic group, but just because of the demographics of Hawaii, it was a mixture of mostly people of, East Asian descent, as well as, Hawaiians and others as well.
It's an incredible story about Asian Americans representing the country early on,
Hmm.
right? So
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
think yeah, definitely. Well, hopefully this is the first step in it getting recorded and us
Mhm.
talking more about it.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so will you uh we'll conduct the oral history today. We're doing
Okay,
this via Zoom. So my name is Michael Lee. I'm the president of the Museum of Chinese America. And I'm here with Brian Niiya. Brian, what would you like your official title be just for the record that we're holding for the oral history?
Well, at present, I'm the content director for Densho, which is a organization based in Seattle, that focuses on the history of the Japanese American World War II incarceration. Um, I am based though in Los Angeles, so I work remotely. I've been working remotely for like 15 years or so.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you for that. And we're meeting here today via Zoom. I'm here at the Museum of Chinese America, and Brian is in Los Angeles. It's January 13th at 3 p.m. And we are here to talk about um, Olympic medalist Richard Tom, as well as a group of Asian American weightlifters from Hawaii, who many of them represented the United States in the Olympics. So thank you so much, Brian. I hope
Sure.
everything's going okay with you and your family in Los Angeles. I hope
Yeah, yeah,
you're
no,
not at a
thanks
coffee
for
shop right now running around.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, we're fairly close to the Palisades area, but fortunately far enough away so that we're not directly affected, although, other than air quality. But,
Right.
but yeah, we know a lot of people and, we're close to UCLA. I do some work for UCLA. My wife teaches at UCLA, so we know a lot of people who had to be evacuated or even have lost houses. So it feels like this, yeah, this moment in history where, a lot's going to change from here
Yeah, I
on
can't
out.
imagine what it's like being a resident in Los
Mhm.
Angeles right now. So thank you for,
Mhm.
taking the time to do this during
Sure. Yeah.
this crazy time. So yeah, I mean, we just wanted to get started about
Sure.
learning more about the history, the historical narratives of Asian American athletes.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so we just wanted to start on the background and kind of your personal interest. Can you
Mhm.
share what initially drew you to the history of, Richard Tom and his teammates?
Well, so I started working for the Japanese American National Museum when they first opened, or actually even before they opened, right out of graduate school in 1987. So I worked with them on and off for like a decade into the 90s. We had talked everyone knew that I was very much a sports fan and interested in sports history. So I think there was an understanding that at some point in the history of the museum, there would be an exhibit on Japanese Americans and sports, and that I was the logical one to kind of be the curator for that. Time went on, and in the late 1990s, that museum started work on a new building, the new pavilion, which opened in 2000. And so one of the exhibits for that new pavilion was to be this exhibit on sports. And it became titled More Than a Game, Sports in the Japanese American Community. Um, I had really argued that I wanted it to be more of an Asian Americans in sports story because, as we'll see, there's a lot of connections and overlap. But at that time, I was kind of overruled, so it ended up just being Japanese Americans. But nonetheless, where the stories sort of collide and coincide, especially in Hawaii, just given the demographics of Hawaii, it did include stories of other Asian Americans as well as part of this general storyline. So in the process of doing this research, and I at the time lived in Hawaii. I moved to Hawaii in the mid 1990s and got to know some people there. And I'm not even sure how I came across the story. It might have started with the swimmers, as I mentioned earlier. There's a similar story with a group of swimmers from Hawaii and a swimming coach named Soichi Sakamoto. He's a Japanese American, second generation Japanese American, who had this audacious idea that he was going to train his group of swimmers who had never really swum competitively. This is in the late 30s, and have them go to the Olympics in 3 years in 1940. He called it the 3-year swim club, and um, he had no training and just using, methods he learned here and there and stuff he invented. He trained this group of local kids, and the kids represented just kind of the demographics of Hawaii, right? So it's largely people of Asian descent, Hawaiians, Portuguese, the demographics of Hawaii. And the 1940 Olympics was canceled, but um, had there been a 1940 Olympics, many of his progeny would have actually ended up representing the U.S. in the Olympics. And that story continues into the 40s, and there actually is a substantial body of swimmers from Hawaii who end up in the Olympics in 1948 and 1952. And sort of in parallel, there's this weightlifting story, and there's this one guy by the name of Emmerich Ishikawa from Maui who is both. He's a swimmer and he's also a weightlifter. And I think I might have come across the story from interviewing Emmerich. You also lifted weights and weight. You were and just kind of tracing down. There's a historian of uh, I guess, weightlifting historian named John Fair. I think he teaches at somewhere in Texas. And he wrote about a guy by the name of Bob Hoffman, who was an entrepreneur. He ran the Strength and Health magazine and started York Barbell Company, which was based in York, Pennsylvania. So he had a vested interest in promoting weightlifting as a sport because it would buttress his business ventures. But he came up with this notion that there was kind of this untapped talent among people of color in the U.S. And he actively sought out African Americans, Eastern European Americans, Asian Americans, because weightlifting, is one of those sports where there's weight classifications. And he actively sought out these people of these different ethnic backgrounds who were kind of locked out of other sports, right, due to discrimination. So he actively sought out Asian Americans. And then, as it happened, there was a group of weightlifters in Hawaii who were just, friends locally, of which Richard was one of them, along with Emmerich, the swimmer, Harold Sakata, who was kind of Sakata had passed away by the time I did this research, but everyone I talked to described him as kind of the ringleader of this group. He's better known. He became kind of famous in the 1960s as an actor. He was the guy that played the villain Oddjob in the James Bond movies in the 1960s. But he was
Oh,
actually
interesting.
this yeah, he's actually this Nisei guy named Harold Sakata, who from the Big Island of Hawaii, who was an Olympic silver medalist as a light heavyweight weightlifter in 1948. So anyway, the story kind of developed from there, and then and you know all of this, but what happens is this group of weightlifters from Hawaii kind of get together and start working out together, start winning local competitions, migrate to the continental US because they kind of outgrow the competition locally and want to see where they stood against the rest of the country. Got in contact with Bob Hoffman, got invited to York, Pennsylvania, and kind of set up shop there. And the story sort of goes from there, and they end up in the 1948 Olympics. And that story kind of continues on with the story of Tommy Kono, he's actually from Sacramento, California, but he becomes this, arguably the greatest American weightlifter of all time in the 1950s. But anyway, so that's sort of the origin of this story. And then at the time I was doing the research in the late 1990s, several of these people were still alive. So I was able to interview Tommy, I was interviewed Emmerich Ishikawa, and interviewed Richard Tom. Um, and it's Hawaii, so people are pretty easy to find. I remember when I first moved there, I asked someone, "Oh, do you know where I can find, person X?" They said, "Oh, just look them up in the phone book." Which being from Los Angeles, no one is in the phone book, no one's listed. So I did, and I guess there at the time, I'm sure it's different now. At the time, I think it regular, everyone was in the phone book, even fairly prominent people. So I think I might have found Richard Tom that way. And went and interviewed him. And I don't, unfortunately, my notes and so on from that time are buried somewhere in the archives of the Japanese American National Museum. So I wasn't able to track that down. So my memories of it aren't very sharp. This is like 25 or more years ago. But I do remember, yeah, interviewing Richard. I think as his home, and I believe he lived in the Palolo area, if I'm not mistaken, of Honolulu. I don't know how familiar you are with Honolulu, but it's kind of an urban area in town, kind of east of the downtown area. Kind of a working class area. Um, and yeah, I just remember him being very, very open. And, I think like a lot of people his age, he must have been 80-ish at the time I interviewed him. Maybe maybe a little younger, but something like that. And I remember him as being very happy that someone was interested in this story. Um, and he was a good storyteller, talked about those times in the Olympics. The thing I remembered about him and really all of the weightlifters is that even though they were all old men, I remembered them as being like really in good shape physically. They were all still working out. Um, in fact, Richard at the time actually asked me if I wanted to work out with him. Um, and I said, I was not a weightlifter, so I politely declined, which I kind of regret. I kind of
Yeah,
thought
it
that
would
would
have
have
been
been
great to
kind of
see
cool.
their
That would have been cool to
routines.
to train with an Olympic weightlifter.
Yeah,
I
definitely.
don't know how serious he was, but I thought that was kind of funny. But yeah, all of the athletes that I interviewed, the swimmers and weightlifters in particular, all of them were like in really, really good shape. As those are sports that you can continue to practice as you get older. And it was quite the contrast because I interviewed a lot of wrestlers and boxers and football players as well. And that group was, notably didn't do as well, naturally, right? Sports that involve getting hit in the head and contact. And so, unfortunately, I really saw the contrast between, those the sports, I guess, that were good for you and the ones that were probably harmful for people in ways that we maybe didn't understand back then. But anyway, yeah, that's so that was kind of my encounter with him. And then for the exhibit, it was actually a physical exhibit, so we borrowed and or sought artifacts to show at the museum for part of the show. I don't think we showed anything from Richard. I don't remember now if he had things or not. But for whatever reason, we didn't have any of his things on display. Emmerich's unfortunately lost all of his things in a fire. Um, but we had some of Tommy Kono's material, and there was a fourth Olympian named Richard Tomita, and he had all kinds of stuff. So we had his entire Olympic uniform and his Olympic I don't know what you call it, but like the opening ceremony outfit, the suit, and so forth. So we had a lot of stuff from him and medals. I don't think we had any. I'm not positive. I don't remember having anything from Richard at all. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if the family has things or uh, I don't know as a museum if you've inquired if they've got if they've got things from that time period. But yeah,
Well, we'll speak with his granddaughter soon.
yeah,
She's
yeah.
looking around and seeing if the family has heirlooms. But I guess yeah, I mean that's wonderful that they were so accessible and you were able to interview all of them and kind of revisit these times with them. I mean, thinking about Richard and his teammates in particular, was there anything significant in your findings that you found in terms of their story or in terms of their experiences that you found during your research?
I mean, I just thought it was an interesting story and how, the through kind of the encouragement and the, sponsorship in some ways, both locally and, nationally from Bob Hoffman, that really enabled them to continue to compete, right? Many of them, were able to get jobs working at York Barbell. So, that became kind of this weightlifting mecca in some ways where, they were, we in those days, there was this whole story about how, the Soviet bloc countries, right, who we were, the U.S. was, in this rivalry with the communist world, right, and there was all this complaint that the athletes from the Soviet bloc were kind of subsidized by the government, right, that they were supported by the government, and that was an unfair advantage for the Americans, and it struck me that what was happening at York Barbell was almost similar, right? It was under capitalism, but it was kind of this company that was sort of, supporting this Olympic effort by kind of giving the weightlifters these jobs that allowed them to train and support themselves, while they're doing this. And I thought that was an interesting aspect of the story. I Offhand, I don't recall if Richard was one of those that actually went to York. I don't think he did now, but I'm not positive. I have to look at that. I know Emmerich and Harold Sakata did go to York and kind of lived there and trained there for a time. But there was definitely the strong kind of local connection between all of them. I mean, I think they were kind of friends first, and and kind of it's always easier to train, I think, when you've got this cohort of people that have similar goals and similar interests. And I really got this strong sense of esprit de corps from them. They really cared about each other, and again, even though it was an exhibit, ostensibly an Asian American or Japanese American sports exhibit, kind of the ethnicity almost didn't come into play. It was more just kind of in Hawaii, it was more kind of these local boys kind of thing, right? It didn't matter what you were. It was more this local identity, the sense of being from Hawaii that seemed to be more relevant in some ways than the fact that some were Japanese, Richard was of Chinese descent and so forth, right? It was more this localness that seemed to be more relevant for them. And I
Sure.
think it's that way, and I think it is that way. maybe was is better to say, was that way in Hawaii in a lot of ways that, the sense of being Japanese American or Chinese American. I mean, they don't use those terms there, in the same way that we do here on the continent.
Did you, from your research, did you sense any kind of racial aspect to the story? I mean, it is interesting that all of them came, from the same region and were able to beat all these weightlifters from around the country, which is really fascinating, right? I mean, instead of having a team that's handpicked of multiple people from different regions, they just had all, I think I read all four of them were all from the same region. So was there any aspect of kind of this local mainland versus Hawaiian Islands rivalries or any kind of racial confrontations that they experienced during this time?
I mean, I think there was some ri natural rivalry between, the local group in Hawaii and the mainland group. But I think it also, I think beyond that, I think there was, yeah, there was this strong sense of unity too among all of the weightlifters that I got the sense of that there was really this because I think it's a distinct subculture, in then and even now it is, right? These a lot of them were also into bodybuilding in those early days, and this it was kind of this. I think it was more of a subculture then than it is now. I think now everybody lifts weights and it's part of kind of it's become more mainstream. But I think back in those days, those guys were thought of as a little odd or, unusual. It wasn't something everyone did as much. I remember, I think talking to Tommy and he said that he had started a health food store and he was selling exotic products like yogurt, um, which again it's like commonplace today, but so I think because of that there was this sense of being different that kind of drew them together. And I never heard anyone talk about any racism, that there was kind of this understanding among these guys who all did this thing at a high level, in different weight classes and so on. And I think part of it is also just this, this internalizing this rivalry with the Soviet bloc. And I think feeling like, as Americans, we have to defeat the communists. And I think that drew people together as well.
Really fascinating.
So, so.
Did in your talks with Richard, did it ever come up? Did he ever realize that he was the first Chinese American medalist?
I don't think that ever came up. I mean, maybe yeah, I don't, I mean, unfortunately, I don't remember, the details of our conversation all these years ago. But so yeah, I can't answer that. But, it really, yeah, it didn't really come up. My sense is that, um, talking to someone else, this is one of the swimmers, was saying that, the recognition really came years later, when looking back, people realize, hey, there were these Asian Americans in the Olympics in 1948 and 1952. And she said that they really started getting recognized more, decades later. And she said, I think she used the word, their name was Evelyn Kawamoto, that, they would trot us out every 4 years because, every 4 years there's an Olympics. And, inevitably there will be an article about, hey, way back, however many years ago, there was this group of Asian Americans who competed and medaled. And because it wasn't, I, I was interested in the swimmers and weightlifters, but there was also the Korean American diver Sammy Lee, who was a gold medalist. There was the Filipino American swimmer Victoria Manalo Draves. So there was kind of this group of Asian Americans, who were Olympic athletes and Olympic medalists at that time. But this was before there was the sense of Asian American had even been invented, So I think there wasn't that consciousness necessarily at that time, but I think, you know, 30, 40 years later, we group them together as Asian Americans, but I don't know that they did at that time. I think the Hawaii group is different because, like I said, I think they saw themselves as the Hawaii boys. So, I think they saw themselves in that way. But for the others, yeah, I think a lot of that recognition and, consciousness of being pioneers and Asian Americans that comes, looking back, years later, when we kind of, when that idea of Asian Americanness kind of comes into play, which doesn't really happen until the 70s and 80s.
Right. I mean, as you as a historian, I guess you looking at the arc of everything, where do you see their kind of position in Asian American history and kind of contributing to that narrative and that landscape for us in the country?
Um, And again, I don't think they saw themselves in this way at all. But
Yeah.
in this time period, in the late 40s, early 50s, there was also the so-called model minority period. This period when specifically Chinese and Japanese Americans were perceived as being successful, um, and despite overcoming racism and cherry-picked statistics to show that income and education and all those things were high relative to even white Americans. And I feel like the storyline fits into that sort of neatly that, here are these people that, overcame discrimination. Sammy Lee famously in LA, encountered restrictive covenants. He was not able to buy a home in his preferred neighborhood, and there was this big uproar about that, you know. So, there were all of these kinds of, you know, there was still a lot of discrimination. So I think, I think their narrative, looking at kind of the coverage of them at the time, there's a little of that model minorityism there in how they're portrayed, that these hardworking young people, were able to overcome discrimination, and do these things. Um, so I think in looking at them, we have to be careful, in how we frame their accomplishments, and telling kind of this broader story about them as well. So, but it is kind of remarkable because it's like I said, it's just, in multiple sports from multiple parts of the country, even before there was this sense of there being any such a thing as Asian American. You had this group of, I've just named four different ethnic backgrounds, right? Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Filipino, who were all Olympic athletes. And I think people in each of the group were Olympic medalists as well. And so, yeah, it was looking back, it was kind of remarkable. And I think it certainly was for me, discovering this story was kind of inspiring to think that, wow, I never knew this existed. I even wondered, would my life have been different if I knew about, Tommy Kono and Richard Tom and Sammy Lee growing up? Probably not. Yeah, probably would, I probably was not cut out to be a champion weightlifter, but uh, I think there was, I think all of them had kind of this, effect where others followed. So there was kind of this whole, for a couple decades, there was this continual succession of Asian Americans in both swimming and in weightlifting that continued into the 50s and 60s before it sort of faded away. And I think it kind of follows the arc of American Olympic weightlifting in general, because America is like a major power in Olympic weightlifting into the 1960s, and then since then it's kind of, you know America hasn't really been a factor internationally in weightlifting, since that time. So
Yeah, I guess as a sports historian and also looking at Asian Americans, do you see that pattern of uh, Asian Americans having success in certain sports and then having subsequent generations getting involved in it? like to your point, weightlifting, swimming. I can think of things like figure skating,
Yeah,
and
figure
things like that,
skating.
right? I
I,
mean,
I, I I
have you
think it,
seen those patterns from this research and from other, things that you've looked at?
yeah, no, I think figure skating is a good example. Gymnastics is a good example, right? Where there's kind of this this group of Asian American pioneers in both areas that I think have inspired other kids, Asian American kids, to follow them. I think you're seeing it a little in baseball now, right? Where, when I was growing up, there were no Asian or Asian American players in Major League Baseball, and now there's too many to count, you know? Um, yeah, I mean, I think as a kid growing up, there's something about seeing someone who looks like you, and thinking, hey, maybe there is a possibility that I can do that. It may not be a conscious thing, but in some cases, I think it is, but in a lot of cases, it's just unconscious. And I think you do see these clusters of Asian Americans entering these different sports, as you pointed out, like figure skating, certainly gymnastics, and arguably baseball now. So yeah, so I think that's you know uh, representation is important in some ways, in ways maybe that we don't even understand. And in again, in some ways it sort of doesn't even matter what you are as an Asian American. It's just phenotypically someone who looks like you, whether they're of Vietnamese or Chinese or Korean or whatever descent, is still, I think, at some level you can still identify with them.
Absolutely. I mean, what do you think about this story caused it to be not as more well known or not as widespread as than when you did your research. I mean, to your point, nobody really heard of them before, and before you did your research, you never even heard of them. So, yeah,
Yeah.
why do you think this story was something that, not that highlighting Asian Americans was very popular back in those days, right? But like that aside, why do you think it never kind of surfaced?
Well, I think part of it is that, Americans don't really care about Olympic sports, except during the Olympics, and then we forget about it again for 4 years. So I think that's part of it. I mean, if they had been, Major League Baseball players, it'd be a totally different story. Um, but weightlifting and swimming are, they're not popular sports in in the U.S. I mean, they're, popular in terms of there are people who compete in them, but as spectator sports, we only care about them during the Olympics. And as I mentioned, with weightlifting, America kind of isn't really a international power in weightlifting, after the 60s. And so, Americans are kind of ethnocentric. So we only follow sports that Americans are good at in the Olympics. So, you know, I think most Americans couldn't name an Olympic weightlifter, ever. It's not just the Asian American ones. I think a lot of it is just the specific interest or lack thereof in those particular sports among mainstream Americans, as opposed to people who have a particular interest in those sports. Well, then, it was a long time ago. It was before, like I said, before there was a conception of there being Asian Americans, and so I think that has a lot to do with it too. I mean, I think if even if it was an obscurish sport like weightlifting, if this had happened, today in 2012 or 2016, we would, because of the media, and there's an Asian American press and websites and so on and social media, this would be a lot better known than it was, in 1948 and 1952. So I think it's a combination of those things.
Yeah. Us being the Museum of Chinese America and kind of recognizing Richard Tom as the first Chinese American medalist. Anything specifically about Richard's story that you remember that was, somewhat specific to him, that highlighted him as an individual?
Unfortunately, yeah, it's not really. Yeah, in those days I wasn't recording my interviews, which I really regret. And like I said, my notes are all buried somewhere at the Japanese American National Museum. So unfortunately, other than what I mentioned, I don't remember a lot of the details about his story and about my interactions with him. I really only met him just that one time, uh, and like I said, I regret not taking him up on his offer to to work out with him. I might have injured myself.
It would have been fascinating to see the routines. No, don't worry. I had to ask, and
Sure,
hopefully,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
if you do ever do find your notes, please let us know.
yeah.
I guess
Oh,
looking back on it, on this research, right? What do you think is the lasting impact of this on the historical record?
I mean, I think we'll see. I feel like since the time I worked on that exhibit, there really hasn't been an Asian American sports research project, right? There have been pockets of it. There's been interest in particular sports or particular groups of people, but I'd love to see a book or a film or an exhibit or a project that documents the history of Asian Americans in sports, of which this would be, an important part of the story. So I hope that, future curators or future historians hearing this story will be inspired to look at this story, but also other stories that haven't been covered or maybe that aren't even known today, and to kind of build a larger story out of this. So so yeah, I feel like it's an incomplete story at this point. These men and women were kind of this first generation of Asian Americans in the Olympics, but it would be interesting to see. I don't think there's been a systematic exploration of the ones that followed them necessarily. Again, there's interest in specific individuals, specific sports, but not anything systematic, which I think would be great to look at and to see if there are other patterns or other kind of storylines that kind of link or kind of thread through all of their stories.
Yeah, so definitely interesting to hear if their achievements created spawns new cultures within
Hmm.
the sport
Yeah,
that
yeah,
we had no idea about.
right.
Are there any other aspects about sports stories that you would like historians and researchers to build upon in the future?
Um, really, since working on that project, I really haven't gone back to it. I remain interested, but I've moved on and have done a lot of other things subsequently. So I feel like I'm out of the loop right now in terms of sports history. So I don't want to talk about, yeah, there are probably things going on that I'm not aware of. So I'm gonna evade that question for now.
Fair enough. Just going to last couple of questions about
Sure,
your
sure.
personal work. Did this research affect any of the work that you were doing at Densho or at the Japanese American National Museum, aside from the exhibitions that ran?
Um, A little bit. I mean, I toyed with the idea of writing something more extensive on Tommy Kono and Emerich Ishikawa because both of them were among the Japanese Americans who ended up in the incarceration of Japanese Americans. They were in the same camp. They were in Tule Lake in California, and Tommy actually said that he was inspired to take up weightlifting by seeing Emmerich, who started a weightlifting club at Tule Lake. Tommy's this teenager at Tule Lake. So I was interested in possibly pursuing that a little bit. I have, literally 20 different things I'm interested in pursuing. So it ended up, I ended up not pursuing it. And then John Fair, who I mentioned and whom you might want to talk to actually ended up writing a weightlifting biography of Tommy Kono uh, fairly recently. So he's the one that sort of dug up that article I wrote for the Hawaii Herald and had it republished in a kind of strength and physical culture journal recently.
Yeah, did any of your subjects ever discuss like the contrast between representing the United States in the Olympics and then contrasting that with internment and kind of being placed into camps?
No one really did. They were
Hmm.
all uh, maybe I should have pressed them more, but they were all very patriotic and very, looking forward. And the at that time, this is the 90s. I think there wasn't as much comfort and knowledge about talking about that stuff as there is now, or at least in the decades since. So yeah, that's something I probably should have pushed further. But yeah, like I said, no one I interviewed, including Richard, I remember said anything about, discrimination, or even though I'm sure they experienced it. Um, but yeah, no one really talked about that. And I think the Hawaii group in particular, um, growing up Asian American in Hawaii is different than growing up Asian American everywhere else, right? You're kind of the majority. So I think, um, you know, their experiences with race are going to be very different than those of, people who grew up on the continent. So I think the Hawaii people in general, they just didn't think that way. You grow up in Hawaii, you know, knowing that you're as good as anybody else and you can achieve anything in ways that those of us who are born and raised on the continent, inevitably we don't think that way, or we have to train ourselves to think that way, I think.
It is a different place for Asian Americans over there for
Yeah.
sure. Um, Last question, and what role do you see your research playing in the broader efforts of the Friends of the National Asian Pacific American Museum?
Well, it's not for me to say, but I think sports is a really interesting thing to look at, because I think a lot of the it's kind of a fun way to address serious issues. So I think sports are, yeah, I hope that there will be collections and exhibits and stories about athletes, because many of the issues that come up in studying Asian American history in general can be seen in the sports world. Um, and I remember making this argument, and an academic historian kind of chided me and said, "Well, no, no, sports isn't important because it's a way to you know, uh, encourage people to study these issues. Sports is important in its own right." And I was thinking, I think that's the difference between academic historians and public historians. Academic historians have an audience that's forced to listen to them, whereas public historians have to earn their audience, or do things in a way that people find interesting. So you know, so I think sports is a vehicle that we can do that, because it's fun, there's great images, there's great artifacts, but we can tell serious stories using sports, as curators. So yeah, I would say that, um, yeah, I hope that the folks that are working on this project will look at athletes and look at sports, and think about ways that they can help tell this larger story.
Incredible. Yep, I'm a huge NBA fan. Herb Tam, our curator here, is a huge NBA,
Yeah, me too.
basketball fan.
Yep, yep.
So, we applaud you, and we agree with that statement wholeheartedly. So,
So
no, but
is there an entire section on Jeremy Lin planned?
one day, but they have already the documentary films and everything like that. I think it's been well documented so far for now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a
But
very strange.
as
Even
time
even
goes
though
on,
even though that happened not that long ago, it's still such a strange story to me of how it's unbelievable that that happened. Still, it's like if someone made that up, you'd think, no, that couldn't happen.
it was an incredible time. I gotta say, I
Yeah.
was fortunate enough to go to that Lakers game, so
Oh,
it was incredible. Yeah, and it was just a perfect storm. The cable networks were fighting, so they
yep,
weren't even televised the games on TV. So you had to go out to the bars and actually go watch it.
yeah. No, I was
And so
I
everybody was
was
together.
I was and am a hardcore Laker fan, but for that game, I didn't mind at all that they lost.
Hey, I mean, Kobe still scored 38, I think, or he scored a bunch of points too, right? So
Yeah.
it was just a great game. A lot of fun. Well, thank you so much, Brian. I
Sure.
mean, that was really the questions that we had. We love the fact that you unearthed this story, and I hope we can learn more about Richard Tom and yeah, to your point, like it'd be interesting to see what cultures flourished out of this um after this period and what happened to all the weightlifters, the
Right.
weightlifting clubs, and did
Mhm,
they
mhm, mhm.
come back and did they have even a more of an impact because they came back with medals, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah. Yeah. No, I'm just sorry I don't remember more because it was a long time ago. But yeah, I hope that someone picks up the ball and runs with it because I think there's a lot more we can learn about these stories.
yeah, the fact that you drew attention to it is the first start, right? So this
Yeah.
is great. Yeah, did I anything else that you wanted to cover? I feel like Brian did such a good job kind of covering the questions for me. I didn't have to ask all of them one by one.
Yes, Brian, thank you so much. I
Sure.
really enjoy this topic. Uh, I will send you the interview consent form so
Okay.
that we can archive your interview. I'm
Okay.
in
Okay.
charge of collections and archives, by the way. So I have one additional question. I hear you said when you interview Richard Tom, you didn't record the interview, but you made notes. And the
Yeah.
notes is preserved at the National Museum of Japanese America,
I
right?
think so.
Okay. So do you think
Yeah.
it's accessible or is that possible for us to get a copy
Yeah,
of
maybe.
those?
Yeah, I go there a lot.
Okay.
I still do work for them. So when I go one of these times, I'll see if I can track
Okay.
down that box. And uh, if there is anything, I'll definitely let you know and send it to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, yeah.